Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a story you think you know, but we're going to focus on a part that almost always gets left out. What happened to Adam and Eve after they left the garden?
All right, so let's get right into it. We all know the basics, right? The forbidden fruit, getting kicked out of Eden, but what happened next? Well, that's where the story gets really interesting. It's a story about a long, profound silence, decades of it, that would test their faith in a way you can't even imagine.
And the scriptures are super clear about this. Once they were outside the walls of Eden, it wasn't just a change of scenery. Their direct line to God, it was completely cut off, gone.
So yeah, this is way more than just moving out of the perfect neighborhood. This was a total, complete spiritual lockdown. The texts even have a term for it, spiritual excommunication. Basically, they were on their own with zero divine guidance.
So you gotta wonder, right? How long did this last? How long were they just left to figure things out in this tough new world, with nothing but fading memories of paradise?
Get this, we're talking about 50 to 60 years. That's a huge chunk of a lifetime. It's long enough for them to have kids, and for those kids to grow up and have their own kids. Imagine becoming grandparents. And for that entire time, nothing. Just silence from above.
So, let's explore what this really meant. This period of silence wasn't just their personal struggle. This literally shaped the first 2 generations of humankind, raising a family with absolutely no divine roadmap.
So picture this. Over these long decades, their family is growing. But Adam and Eve, they're totally haunted. They can't quite remember their past, the whole plan of salvation is fuzzy, and they have zero answers for their kids when they ask the big questions, What's all this about? Why are we here? And on top of it all, they're just drowning in regret, blaming themselves for that one choice with the forbidden fruit.
And this quote really nails it. It says, they were mystified and perplexed by the enigma of life. I mean, how are you supposed to be a guide for your children when you're completely lost yourself? They couldn't solve the puzzle of their own lives.
Okay, so after half a century of this hardship, this confusion, what breaks the silence? What could possibly change things? Well, it all comes down to one single, almost desperate act of faith.
Even though they probably felt like they were cut off for good, something started to stir inside them. A really powerful, just irresistible impulse to try and get help, to reach out to the very God they hadn't heard from in their entire adult lives.
And that leads to this huge turning point. They did it. They knelt down together and just started praying, trying to punch through what the scripture calls the stony silence of the heavens. And then, right in the middle of their prayer, something amazing happens. They're interrupted.
But it wasn't just some random noise. It was a voice. A voice the text describes as soft, but powerfully penetrating. A voice they knew. And it was coming from the direction of Eden. It seems like heaven was just waiting for them to finally make the call. And you have to understand what a huge triumph this was. I mean, after all those years, just working up the courage to pray was a win. But to actually be heard and to get an answer? Wow, that was a game changer. All right, so let's look at the response. This was the first instruction they'd gotten in over half a century, but it was probably not what they were expecting. In fact, it was kind of weird and really confusing. Okay, so the first couple of commands make sense. Draw near unto the Lord, worship Him. You can imagine that felt pretty good to hear. But then came part 3. They had to offer the firstborn of their flocks as a sacrifice on an altar.
And why? I mean, you can just feel their confusion. Why would you slay a young lamb or a newborn calf and burn it? What's the point? It makes zero logical sense. What could God possibly get out of that? And this is really the key to the whole story. The Lord gave them absolutely no explanation. And between the 2 of them, Adam and Eve couldn't come up with one either. They were given a command they simply could not understand.
So, this is it. This is the big test. Their response to this totally baffling command is the whole point of their 60 years of struggle. It all boiled down to one thing. Could they obey, even when they didn't understand?
What's so powerful here is how the scripture puts it. There's no mention of an argument or hesitation or asking for a clarification. It just says, and Adam was obedient unto the commandments of the Lord. That's it. Even though it made no sense, he just did it. And this really gets at a core conflict, doesn't it? Our human minds, our logic, we just revolt against things we can't wrap our heads around. But this wasn't a test of intellect.
This was a test of faith, which sometimes requires obedience even without a full explanation.
So, the big lesson here, the takeaway from their whole experience, is that the greatest thing we can learn is that when God gives a command and we obey, we will always be in the right, even if it makes no sense to us at the time.
So this whole incredible story, from being exiled to the decades of silence and then finally reconnecting, it leaves us with a really big question, doesn't it? It makes you wonder, is true faith really about understanding everything, or is it about having the trust to move forward anyway?